Hello, I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers, presented by WXEL Television and Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore in Delray Beach. My guest today is an author, a journalist, and a historian, and she specializes in those stories about Florida history that I guarantee you've never heard of. She's the author of 10 books. It is my pleasure to introduce Florida's history detective, Sally J. Ling. Thank you. Sally, thank you for coming today. And I want to talk first about the topics that you explore in your books, because I said Florida history and Florida's history detective. This is not the history we're taught in school, or most of us would have paid a lot more attention.
It wasn't the history I heard either. In fact, I really didn't know a whole lot about Florida. Most people don't, because it's a state that's relatively young. So I didn't learn much about Florida. In fact, I moved to Florida in 1966. I moved to Tampa, and then subsequently moved to South Florida in 1976. But it wasn't until the 1990s that I really looked into the history, and the 2000s, that I looked into the history of Florida, some unusual history of Florida, and found out that there was more to it than met the eye.
That surprises me that you're not a native, because you really found this passion in this state that you adopted.
True, true. And most people aren't natives, although I married one. I married a native
that
Floridian.
Counts. Okay.
But of course, I came into my love of history very late in my life, in my 50s, and since then I have just loved to hear the stories that you have to dig for, because nobody really knew what was going on then.
I want to look at the brand new book, which is Who Killed Leno and Louise, and it's a story virtually no one knew about, even if they lived in that area. I first heard the story through you maybe even a decade ago. I'm not quite sure exactly how long ago, because
Close.
you've written a magazine article with that same title.
Yes, yes. It took me 8 years to research this subject. There was a couple who lived in Boca Raton in 1948, and they were murdered. It was a double homicide. The police did try to solve the mystery, but over the years it became a cold case, and it slipped through the cracks. And when I was doing research on another book, The History of Boca Raton, I did a chapter on murder and mayhem, which highlighted some of the specific murders that had occurred, or crime that had occurred in Boca Raton. And this was one of them. And it was just amazing to me that nobody ever really delved into this reason why they were murdered and tried to solve it. So I was elected.
How is it that you came to unearth this particular story and the other stories like it that no one else, that no one cared?
You know, there were several magazine articles about this particular murder, double homicide, but the individuals really didn't take it farther than just gathering information that was already there and recompiling it. So I figured, if I'm a history detective, I better do some detective work. And so I just started working on that case, and I found all kinds of stuff.
You must be an incredible researcher.
That is the most interesting aspect of what I do, I believe, is the research. I liken it to gold mining. You find a little nugget, and you think, oh, okay, well, I found this little nugget. I know that there's a vein there somewhere, but I just don't know where it is. So you go into the mine, and you start tapping out, and eventually you find that. And that has happened so many times, and I am convinced it's divine intervention.
Do you spend the lion's share of your time doing the digging compared to the writing?
I do it simultaneously, because I never know really where my research is going to take me.
Ah, interesting.
So I may write a chapter and think it's concluded, but the next day I might find some interesting information that I need to include, so then I have to go back and rewrite. So it's a lot of rewriting.
Do you enjoy the hunt?
The hunt, that's the best.
Is it like working a puzzle?
Yes, and I love to find the little pieces. when I was a young girl, my sisters and I used to do puzzles, 1,000-piece puzzles, 2,000-piece puzzles. We loved puzzles. And they'd sit out there on the card table for weeks on end until we found that last piece. And that's the way I've almost felt like with this particular book, is that it took me so long because I couldn't find the final piece. I knew the players, I knew what had happened, but it wasn't until, honestly, this year that I actually finished the book because I found the final piece to the story.
So you don't get frustrated easily, that's obvious. And there must be a lot of dead ends, especially when it came to this book.
Yes, but I have to tell you, again, it was divine intervention, this particular book especially. I'll tell you just a very small piece of it because this is indicative of the other things that happened. The gentleman that was killed was Italian. He came from Rome to the United States. I was researching him, and his cousin was a very well-known New York artist, and Leno was a sculptor, a beautiful sculptor. So his cousin's name was Pietro, and he had been into New York and the Washington area, and he had donated all of his memorabilia to the Smithsonian Institute. So when I started researching, I found a letter that Leno had written to Pietro when Leno was in Italy and Pietro was in the United States. And it was in Italian. Well, I don't speak Italian, but my neighbor across the street is Italian. So I took it to him and I said, could you please translate this for me, which he did. And I said, how in the world am I going to find something about his family if they were all in Italy? Who do I go to? He said, well, why don't you try the Italian consulate in Miami? Well, who knew that there was an Italian consulate in Miami? So I called up. It took them 3 weeks to call me back. I said, oh, by the way, how am I going to research this with, see if he has a family back there? His name was Leno Lazzari. She says, you're not going to believe this, but about 6 weeks ago, I got an email from this man's grandson looking for information about his murder.
Wow.
So we were connected through email. We have become the best of friends. He supplied me with a lot of background information, but it's that kind of thing with this particular book that happened so many times.
And we're talking a story that began 60 years ago. Was that the murder was 60-some years ago?
1948.
And I'm not going to give anything away, but there's some wild characters in this story. And after this murder, all of the sculptures disappeared.
They did. They were stolen in the early 1950s. The studio was locked up after the murders, and all of his, he did bas-reliefs, bronze sculptures, marble sculptures, and portraits. And they were all stolen or smashed in the early 50s. And they are nowhere to be found, or at least I have not found them yet. Yet.
This is, to me, typical of what you write. You find the obscure stories, and this is such a great story. Do I have to read it to find out if it is no longer considered a cold case?
Let me say this about that. I consider this a book of faction. And if you look up that word, it is a legitimate literary term. And what it means is a combination of fact and fiction. I started out writing just it as a nonfiction book, but the characters were so real to me that I had to put them in settings. And once you cross, there's a line that you cross over from nonfiction to fiction, and once you cross over that line, it's considered fiction. In Cold Blood, if you go into a bookstore, even though it's written about a true case, it's in the fiction section because he took liberties in some areas, and because of that, they call it fiction. So mine is really faction because I did take liberties. There were scenes that I had to create because I didn't really know what color of dress she wore. Or I had some of the dialogue, but I didn't exactly know what specifically people said. So I had to create some of that. So it reads like a novel, but I can tell you that 95% of what you're reading is true.
And Leno's grandson, has he read the book?
Yes, he is the only one that I sent the manuscript to because I wanted to be sensitive to his family, because for 60 plus years they have been upset about nobody caring about what happened to this case. And I was bound and determined I was going to be sensitive to his family and get his approval before I published.
Sally, did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
I always wrote as a young child, mostly poetry and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that I actually started writing as a profession. And what started me off was a magazine article. A magazine, local South Florida magazine, needed to do an article, and the writer who had been assigned it, she couldn't do it, so she asked me if I would do it, and that's it. Just one thing led to another, as most things do. So I started writing magazines, and then I wrote for the Sun Sentinel, and from that I started writing my books.
Did you, as a child, also happen to have a particular teacher that instilled a love of history?
No, can't say that. Although I have to say that as a child, I grew up in a military family and we moved all over the world. And because of that, we saw a lot of history. Mm-hmm. We lived the history that we're talking about today. So from that standpoint, I loved history, but I wasn't particularly fond of it in school.
And the reason I asked that is because you've also written a children's book.
Yes.
It's a historical children's book based on World War II era.
Yes.
Called Spies, Root Beer, and Alligators. A+ for the title.
Thank you. Actually, I give my older sister credit for that. She came up with it. But yes, what I tried to do is take historical, again, this is a fictional story based on historical fact, of a family that lived on the beach in Boca Raton during the war years, and all the wonderful experiences they had as children, and exploring and going to school and watching the German U-boats blow up the tankers going up the east coast, the Gulf Stream,
and that
during
happened.
World War II.
That happened in Boca Raton. Yeah.
And German spies actually came ashore in Boca Raton in 1942.
Yeah. You know, I applaud you for doing the kids genre. It can't be easy, but I got to say, kids have so many distractions these days. So to write a book that has history in it for that age child, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I would love to think that they would enjoy it.
Was there a particular challenge in writing for children?
Yes, and I don't normally write for children, but because the two principal characters in the book were children, 8 and 10 years old, I figured that would be a good place for them to be situated, was with children.
You just mentioned Boca Raton. I have to talk about your terrific book, nonfiction, Small Town Big Secrets, also about World War II and the Army airfield in Boca Raton. And this had, if I remember correctly from your book, World War II top secret military base.
Correct. Most people don't know, but FAU and the executive airport, Boca Raton Executive Airport, now sit on land that was once a 6,000-acre top secret Army Air Corps base from 1942 to 1947. And I don't know why I was selected. It must be that divine intervention again. But I seemed to pick up subject matter that nobody else talked about. This base was so secret that until I wrote my book in 2005, not one person had ever written a book about this base. And yet everybody knew there was a base there because FAU is on the former land of the base. But even the people that were stationed at the base did not know the degree to which it was secret. So I had to speak with a lot of veterans who actually served on the base in order to put the whole story together, because the pilot didn't know what the engineer was doing, and the medical people didn't know what the guy in the commissary was doing. So until you got all of those people put together and got their stories, it's really a fascinating look at a very, very, very important part of history. And I will tell you that that base played a vital role in winning World War II because of the mission that they had, which was to install maintain, and operate airborne radar. And from that base, every single one of you has a device in your kitchen that you use practically every day. Anybody know what it is?
Microwave oven.
Perfect. That's correct.
Does it surprise you, maybe because it was such a great secret, that none of us ever heard of this?
It doesn't surprise me. Having been in a military family, they had this saying, the need to know. And if you needed to know it, you knew it. If you didn't, nobody spoke about it. And even the men on the base that served there for, could have been for the whole 5 years, 60 years later, they never spoke about it until I interviewed them. That's how secret it was.
And good thing you did it then, because when time goes on, there will be no one to interview.
I would say that of the people that I interviewed, 75 to 80% of them are now deceased.
The book, Small Town, Big Secrets, there also are great photographs in that book. Was that hard to find? Did you have any trouble doing that research?
Actually, no. Once I found a few of the veterans who had photographs that they would share with us, it was wonderful. And of course, the Boca Raton Historical Society, I couldn't have done the book without them. They were marvelous. They had a lot of veterans that had come to the facility over the years and had left photographs. And of course, they had archives there from the base. So it was wonderful place to pick up the photographs along with the veterans.
Another topic, another book, very interesting, a little darker, would be Out of Mind, Out of Sight, The Revealing History of the Florida State Hospital at Chattahoochee and Mental Health Care in Florida. A very long title, but a very interesting book. Why did you want to tell that story?
Actually, while I was researching this book, one of the characters in there had a connection to Chattahoochee. Typical Floridians who had been here for a while call the facility Chattahoochee. It's in the town of Chattahoochee, which is about 45 miles west of Tallahassee. So because it's in that town, everybody said Chattahoochee. And if you were a young person growing up in Florida and your parents did not like what you did, they would threaten you to behave or they would send you to Chattahoochee. And I have discovered that every state had a Chattahoochee. Every state had a Chattahoochee. It could have been called something else, but it was a Chattahoochee. It was the mental hospital. But back to your question, one of the characters in the Who Killed Ellen and Louise book had an association with, actually was sent to Chattahoochee. So I called up there to research to see what I could find out. And I said, do you know of a book that's ever been written about this facility that I could read? And he said, no, there's not a book. I said, what do you mean there isn't a book? He said, nobody's written a book about Chattahoochee. And I said, well, there's going to be one. And this facility is over 135 years old. You'd think somebody would have written about it. But again, I was elected.
Interesting story. As I said, a little darker than some of the others, but interesting. One of my favorite books was Run the Rum In.
Yeah,
and this is South Florida during Prohibition. And yes, the characters you've heard of, Al Capone and his buddies, they were all here. But you found some very interesting things that I never knew of. We had some ladies doing rum running as well.
We had some very progressive women.
There you go.
And it wasn't just the rum runners, because there were two, actually I look at it and I feel that there were five prominent women who were very influential in the Prohibition era, and most people think it was just men. But these women were unbelievable, especially for the 1920s and 30s, which women weren't really, they were secretaries or they were at home. But there were five women. The United States Attorney was a woman. One of the code breakers for the Coast Guard was a woman. And we had two women who were absolutely seeking their fame in providing illegal booze to the rum runners who were coming into Florida. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, South Florida played another very important role in bringing illegal booze into the United States. Most people think it was New York, Chicago, and New Jersey, but Florida, because the Bahamas were wet, all of our booze came in from the Bahamas by boat. And so they used to bring it over to Florida and then run it up through the FEC railroads or else by truck, and that's where a lot of the illegal booze came from.
And
so we played a vital role in that.
Interesting ladies in that book. Sally, let's talk about the process. I want to know how you write. Do you approach each of your projects in the same way? Because you've written many different kinds of stories.
Yes. I think it depends on the story, but I kind of let the story lead me. I never know where my research is going to take me. I never know what path I'm going to go down. So as I do my research, if I find something interesting, I take a right turn. And if I find something interesting over there, I take another turn. And typically, I try to know where I'm starting and I try to know where I'm going, but I don't know what's in between. So I just kind of let the story wind me wherever it is that I need to go. And especially with Leno and Louise, I had to let, and when I do fiction, I let the characters tell me what they want me to say about them, because, and I think a lot of writers who have characters in their stories do. Nonfiction to me is much more cut and dry because I have facts. But when you start building characters, then you really have to kind of listen to that inner voice that tells you how you're going to develop them.
What about editing and rewriting? How much? A lot.
A lot, a lot, a lot. Lots of rewriting, lots of editing. Lots of people help me. I consider this a team effort because by the time I'm ready to publish a book, I'm sick of it. Honestly, I've seen it so many times. All I want to do is get it out of my computer into hard copy form or ebook form and be done with it because I want to move on to the next one. So there's a lot that goes into the process after you write it of making sure that what you wrote is received in a fashion that you want it to be received as perfect as possible. But I have to tell you, every single book that I've read, whether it's been traditionally published or self-published, there's always an error in them. And I'll bet you can show me in the books that you have a period that's off or a quotation mark or a typo or something.
And someone will always point that out.
Yeah.
You know,
they do. And honestly, the reason why it takes so long is because I appreciate people pointing it out to me before I publish it. So I'm very happy for people to point it out.
You know, I invariably will get the question of, I have a story to tell, but I don't know how to get it out. Where do you start?
Either on your computer or with your pencil. You have to get it down. When you write stories, when I first started writing, let's put it that way, right now I pretty much can develop things as I go, but when I first started writing, I just needed to get the information from here onto something that I could read. Then you can embellish, then you can shorten, then you can do anything you want to at that point, but you have to get it out of your head first.
That's so much easier said than done. Do you outline?
I have never outlined.
Oh my.
Yes.
I'm surprised.
I have never outlined. Now, I can't tell you why, except that I've always been a very organized person. So as far as my thoughts are organized, I pretty much know where I'm going, even though I've never outlined. And yet, I'm sure that a lot of people that do that may do it better than I do it.
Are there little scraps of paper taped up to the wall with notes and like we see in detective stories?
No.
Oh, you were very organized.
I have it all in my computer. I have an Excel spreadsheet. I have people's names, their email addresses, their phone numbers, what connection they have. Especially with the Leno and Louise book, there were so many characters in that book and so many people I had to talk to. If I did not put this all down, I would have absolutely lost it.
What's next for Sally J. Ling? Is it Florida's History Detective, or are we sticking with some fiction?
Well, I started a 3-book series called Shea Baker Mysteries, and I am going to finish the 3rd book in that. The first book was called The Cloak. The second one is The Spear of Destiny. And what I have taken is scripture. I brought them into contemporary 21st century time and made them into mysteries. And so Shea Baker will stick with his series. And after the 3rd one, I may continue that series. It's been well received. And the mysteries are, again, all Florida history in these books.
Ah.
Even though they are fiction, they have Florida history in them. So what you're getting is a lesson in Florida history, even though you're reading fiction.
You can't stay away from the history.
Can't stay away.
Sally J. Ling, it has been a pleasure to have you here. I have so enjoyed having you here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been watching Between the Covers, presented by WXEL Television and Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore in Delray Beach. Until next time, I'm Ann Bocock, and thank you so much for watching.